So anyway, advice in finance, yeah, just integrity, integrity, integrity. I mean, intelligence and studying things are a lot less important. All the technical stuff you can learn someday. You can't learn to be an honest, good person. You have to just sort of be it and be warned that every move you make will be judged forever. Almost think of it like the old Christian version of just, every person you treat, how you treat them, all that stuff's just going to be like critical, and I think, again, it's not like I'm this like terrible person that needed to be reminded of this every day. It's just this idea that occasionally you feel like you can be yourself or make this lapse of judgment that'll be forgiven or something like that, and you just can't. You got to be really, really, really careful at all times. If you're worried about Wall Street at 17, you're probably going to do really well. I just say that don't fly too close to the sun. I was working on Wall Street at your age, and I think that despite the fact that I quote unquote got ahead by doing so, there was still this kind of like you can slow down. The life will pass you by if you don't stop.
I'm not in a rush. But no, I appreciate all your advice. Big fan of your old school investing 101.
What are your thoughts in building in developing countries? Because I've been a New York City native for all my life, and I was thinking like it's kind of hard to build here. So what if like I were to go somewhere else and build there instead?
Yeah, I mean, that's, what did I say, go west? That's the old advice to entrepreneurs, right? Because California wasn't totally developed. So, yeah, absolutely. Why not, right? I mean, GDPs in those countries will develop over time. And if you're going to be the king of pharmaceuticals in the Philippines, I think, or Indonesia, I mean, you certainly can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. If you look at this company, Aspen Pharmacare, they're in South Africa. They kind of did that in Africa, and the company's worth many, many billions of dollars. There are a number of other stories like that in South America and Asia and other places that are less trodden. Even the Nordic region has its own little pharmaceutical space that is interesting. So if you look at a country that's growing GDP and growing population, you absolutely have less competition. You still have Pfizer's and Merck's out there, but again, I think you could outfox them and run circles around them pretty easily. So countries like Turkey are exciting. Tons of places to do business and grow, and you grow as that country grows. So I totally think you're onto it.
Where do you kind of see it, within the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, I was aware of Bitcoin at the start of Bitcoin, so I'm a geek. If it moves on the internet, I'm trying to watch it and pay attention to it. So I was around the hoop there in 2011, 2010. So I was definitely, aware of it. I had an analyst who asked me to short it actually in 2011. We actually looked into a possible way to short Bitcoin. He was just like, "Hey, Martin, this is fake money. We got to short it." And I was like, "Oh, okay. If you want me to short some, I'll short some." That's how a portfolio manager works. You have 10, 20 analysts. They bring you stock ideas, or in this case, this exotic asset idea, and you listen to them. You let them, give them enough rope to hang themselves with. Obviously, if they're asking you to commit financial suicide, you don't do it, but you got to trust your team. And, this guy had this brilliant idea to short Bitcoin at like 50 cents or $1 or something. It obviously wouldn't have worked out, so I'm happy we didn't short Bitcoin. But, I think this idea had been around before as well, by the way. I mean, there's a reasonable thesis that some of the PayPal founders are either, one of them is Satoshi himself, or they helped Satoshi along the way, or whatever. They were the earliest adopters. I think that's probably true. So, this idea had been around for a long time, and there had been proto-cryptocurrencies. Even some of the video game currencies are probably a good example. And I know the Kraken CEO was a sort of professional gamer who got into crypto through the parallels of video game currency. So people have been thinking about money pretty broadly forever. Hashcash with Atom Back and others, so there's certainly, a lot of predecessors and stuff like that. So I've studied those and been interested in those. And I do think that if you could just go on mute, that'd be nice. Thanks. So I think Bitcoin's going somewhere. Where it's going, I don't know. I think the problem with this stuff is that you have to patch it. And software that is distributed is hard to patch because there's no consensus mechanism. And I think that there's, or the consensus mechanism isn't very well thought out. So I think the problem with Bitcoin and Ethereum and many other cryptocurrencies is that they can't be upgraded. And the best analogy that I have that kind of just dawned on me in prison was that cryptocurrencies are quite similar to programming languages. Programming languages have steering committees, technical committees, and so forth. Like the ECMAScript committee for JavaScript is one that I kind of know more up close and personal. And these committees meet, right? And they sort of discuss, okay, well, do we want to add arrow functions? Do we not want to add arrow functions? Do we want to change enumerability of a certain iterable or something like that? You know, really technical programming discussions. And they decide with focus groups and technical groups and subcommittees, they decide should they expand or contract the language. And they take into consideration, obviously, all the changes, breaking changes that are going to sort of result from changing something like a programming language, which a lot of internet infrastructure perhaps is built on or whatever. So the problem with Bitcoin is you want to make a lot of changes to this thing, but can you? And you can see every time there's a proposed change, it's a disaster. So and nobody is that good of a programmer where they can come up with, you know, the final answer at the first start. And we know that, you know, Bitcoin has been modified many times by Gavin and other core Bitcoin programmers, but those guys are gone now. I mean, Satoshi arguably was gone, like kind of left this thing before it even took off. So, you know, it's a really tough place to be without having a steering committee or a technical committee to actually guide the language. You have to have a centralized source, and that's the whole problem. It's the paradox. You know, you want a decentralized currency, but you don't want centralized upgrades. So you either need the perfect currency that's immutable and unchangeable, and that's kind of what Bitcoin is, or you need something that has some centralization, and you can kind of have your cake and eat it too with governance tokens. But to me, that's just centralized, right? So you have this really tough spot. And I think that paradox is going to rear its ugly head over and over again, because the next new shiny currencies, in my eyes, of course, that was Ethereum. The next new shiny currency, which appears superior to Bitcoin, it has all the features of Bitcoin and more. Right now, okay, well, great. I want to go on Ethereum. Well, then there's something called Algorand or Solana or what have you. And it's like, I want to jump ship and do that because that's better. And that will never end. So you need to be able to upgrade the legacy language, programming language of money, basically, or, you know, just quickly jump ship to the next one. And you have to solve this paradox somehow or some way, or you'll never have you'll never have a sort of a store of value. And that applies to utility tokens just as much as it applies to value tokens. So I think this is a gnawing paradox that will kind of like be the fatal flaw of the industry, because if Bitcoin was really, truly kind of adaptable, we would never need another crypto, right? But it has inherent limitations, and therefore we need other cryptos. And because we need other cryptos, therefore we'll never have the perfect crypto. I think there'll be marginal benefits over time, like you will have a crypto that more or less gets everything right, and maybe we'll standardize on that. But enough time will pass and we'll look back and say, oh yeah, man, Windows 3.1 was amazing, but then when Windows 95 came out, it was really cool. And, you know, there'll still be, you know, we'll look back, you know, a long time from now and say, whatever cryptocurrency that we look at today as, okay, it made the final marginal upgrade. We'll still look at that back and say that was, you know, really neither marginal.
I think Munger was a bit more bearish on Bitcoin. He said, even for $100, he would not buy all the Bitcoins in the world. So far, since he said that, it's down like 70%. So far he's been right, but no one really knows, right? It might go to 10 million next month, and
right.
In these markets, you never know.
But Munger's not a software guy, right? Like, he doesn't understand software from a hole in the wall. And I think, nevertheless, he's probably right. Again, I'm pointing out this flaw in Bitcoin that, you know, how do you upgrade something like that? Software is meant...
You can't.
Right.
All of these big Bitcoin guys left. Satoshi, I don't think anyone has heard from him, and no one really knows who he is. The two big developers, like I think in the first year, both of them left. So
right.
No
And
one left.
so without a technical committee or roadmap committee, and even then, if you have that, then you have a problem with centralization, right? So you have this really, like, big conundrum.
Yesterday, I think to really work to stabilize Bitcoin. And the same guys complain about banks, so it's the same exact thing.
Right, you have centralization all over again.
You have a central group that is trying to control the price. This is what you're trying to fight against. And
well, I think it's okay for I'd say it's more an interesting observation because it's okay for Binance to make a bet. I mean, nothing wrong with that. But when you say try to stabilize the price, maybe they're trying to stabilize the price. Maybe they're just trying to make a bet.
A big picture question. I was curious as to his thoughts on.
Yeah, I think, again, I'm not a philosopher, as we were talking about materialism and dualism and stuff like that earlier, but, or monism, and, whether or not we, our consciousness is created by this wetware that we have called the brain. And, I obviously have an opinion about that. But free will is another whole other question, right? Because now you're talking about just deterministic processes and stuff like that. And I kind of, I study dynamical systems in prison from the mathematical side. And there's a lot of emergent behavior that can come from very deterministic processes. And those are well documented and well researched. But, we have a very, very chaotic world and a lot of emergent behavior that we think at least looks really complex, but we're just one vantage point, and it's hard to remove ourselves from that reference point. So I think that what we look at that looks like free will could very well look like deterministic, completely predetermined behavior from another perspective, a vantage point of like a higher species or whatever. So again, does an ant have free will? Probably not, is my guess. That's a fairly simple circuit that could be emulated. Like C. elegans, I think, has basically been completely mapped cell for cell. So if you had a cellular kind of emulator, could you map C. elegans? C. elegans is like an earthworm, if anybody doesn't know what it is. And, or flatworm or roundworm or whatever. I'm not a wormologist. So I think that there's a lot of sort of evidence that we seem to have free will, but it's because our own vantage point is so limited, right? So I think that if you look at the universe as a big quantum computer, I think it's fairly clear that at least at the macromolecular level, there's limited free will. But we're not at the macromolecular level, but we're not at the quantum level. So to some extent, I don't think it makes a difference. Roger Penrose tried to split this baby by saying that some of the things we do in our brain have a quantum implication. I find that hard to believe because, quantum implications sort of exist at the scale of photons more than they exist at the scale of, whatever it is we're working on. And then there's sort of this meta deterministic perspective where okay, so maybe, particles slamming into each other is one thing, but is there an information sort of level where the quantum mechanics doesn't apply? And I think that's sort of an interesting question. So again, a lot of intersection of philosophy and science that I'm ill-equipped to sort of handle. I wish I was more equipped to handle, but that's why I really appreciate some people like Scott Aronson and others. Nick Bostrom's another one. Neither of those guys are on Twitter. I consider them two of the smartest people on the face of the earth. And neither wants to share on Twitter, unfortunately. Scott Aronson has a blog, which is really good. It's called Shtetl-Optimized. He's a professor of and an innovator in a field called quantum complexity, which is sort of a nexus of math, computer science, and physics, and philosophy to some extent. And so he's who I would consider the reigning smartest person in the world. But there's plenty of other candidates. And again, I'd rather read Scott Aronson than hear my own opinions on this stuff. So free will, determinism, Scott Aronson's probably the guy to talk to. Again, my own perspective, it's a little different from Scott's, is that, we are living in essence, and it's Bostromian in a sense, that we're living in a simulation, that our behavior is somewhat governed by the constraints of that simulation. What the constraints of the simulation are, I don't know. And I can answer that question better to the extent that I would have the parameters or the source code of the simulation. Physics is that source code. What that source code is, we don't know. We know a little bit about it, but we probably don't even know very much. For example, I would posit that we don't have real numbers in reality, which is the funniest thing. Real numbers aren't real. But I do think that we have a Planck constant sort of resolution to the universe that limits our ability to interrogate anything below that constant, which is a very small distance and a very small amount of time. And so a second is divisible only so many times under my theory, which isn't a new theory or anything, but just my framework that I'm talking about here. So because of that, there's this whole idea of incommensurate lengths, which I talked about earlier in terms of fractions, that there are a finite amount of sort of lengths that we can use. So therefore, a number like pi cannot actually be expressed in the real world. So there's a pretty interesting sort of like parts of physics that break down under this like is matter discrete or is matter continuous thing. And I do think it has implications for free will. So a lot of science here that is really hard for me to understand. I have very, very poor understanding of this stuff, and I wish I had a better one. But again, that's what Bostrom and especially Aronson are for. If there's other philosophers that kind of straddle the world of science and physics, I'm really curious who anybody would recommend. But for me, on this search, again, Penrose, I guess, would be another one. But Bostrom and especially Aronson were really helpful for me to probe some of these questions. I think the key in any gambling, whether it's trading or betting on a football game or whatever, is not so much how right or wrong you are. It's that when you insist you are right and you are willing to bet it all and you have conviction, if you will, that you are actually right. And I think that's the hardest thing to do in trading too, right? Is that, we all know from trading that you make money when you can put a lot of money on a position, whether you're long or short, that you can put 10% of your portfolio or something substantial like that on a bet, even 20%. Or some traders are really crazy. They'll literally go all in. They'll make a 50 or 100% bet, or a 200% bet, or a 300% bet. And I think the key to finance, a lot of people feel, is that when not so much being right all the time, nobody can do that. But when you make a massive bet that you're right, that's the key. I don't even like making massive bets anymore because it still is too risky, because you may be wrong no matter what. But in my case, for clinical trials, I still do like occasionally making big bets because I tend to be right and I like doing it. So I like to share that. There's no secret. I mean, honestly, the way to be right about clinical trials is to get a lot of experience and do a lot of research and search for things nobody's looking for. It's sort of like being an investigative journalist or maybe a detective, like of a police department or something like that. Like you have to be, looking for clues. And sometimes people will say, well, what does that clue mean? And you have the trite response of maybe nothing, maybe everything, like you just don't know necessarily what, could be a massive clue that a drug is not going to work or will work or whatever. It could be some patent filing that got abandoned that nobody can find, that you find it in some corner of the U.S. Patent Office or whatever. So anyway, I know a lot about that. The financial series, though, in general, I'd say was more for me than for others. Like, for me, I was trying to, find interesting things in my sort of journey across the markets, and sharing them was, the tax of, finding those things. So, for me, I maybe wouldn't have found them if I didn't commit to sharing them. So it's sort of a Richard Feynman experiment of learning by teaching, and you have to learn first before you teach, but you can kind of do them simultaneously, which a lot of students maybe not want to hear, but they want to know that their teacher is really experienced in that area. But I think a lot of times, you may be motivated to teach by forcing yourself to teach something maybe you don't know 100% of, and then you really have to learn it. So there's a little bit of a reverse approach there, but obviously you can't just jump into teaching something complicated if you know nothing about it. But you can learn it shortly before your lecture, and then learn it during your own lecture. This is kind of a fun way to do it. And I think Feynman talked about learning physics while he's teaching it. So okay.
What would be the mass of price?
That's a good thought experiment. There's a wonderful book that I read early in my prison stay called The Physics of Wall Street. You might like that. It doesn't address this exactly, but it's quite a good book regardless. Kind of like a Wall Street book not a lot of people know, but is rather good. The Physics of Wall Street. And then there's a similar one called Nerds on Wall Street, but it's not as good, I don't think. And both are about quantitative investing, basically. So mass is probably volume. Volume is underrated.
Definitely. People still think that there is no such thing as volume. They think it's always 1-to-1, right? Buy, sell, buy, sell.
Well, it is 1-to-1, but
Well, it is, but it's also not because there's aggressive buying and aggressive selling. Right?
well, that's the
So
point.
there's-
Is that to me, volume is disagreement, right? Volume is when a buyer and a seller say, "Nope, you're wrong. Nope, you're wrong," right? And the more of that, that to me, that's always interesting when there's a lot of that, right? And when there's a lot of that, and one side kind of wins, right? The price will go, and you'll see a spike in volume, and usually a spike in price, and kind of you'll see which side has won, based on kind of the direction afterwards. And that's why there's this old saying like gaps get filled. And this is technical analysis, which to me is voodoo, but here's the one place where it kind of makes sense rationally. If a stock's trading 50,000 shares a day, right? Every day, in and out, a little bit up, a little bit down, kind of treading water, then all of a sudden it trades 10 million shares. There's 20 million shares outstanding, and the price doubles, right? Well, what does that mean? I think that's, I want every trader or investor to spend some time thinking about that. Like, can you draw any inference whatsoever? Is it meaningless? Is it really important? Obviously, it's an important event of some kind. There was some news. There was something that kind of happened, right? Otherwise, there'd have been, there wouldn't have been that many trades.
In that case, I think of volume as a force, then less of a mass, less as a mass. I think of it as the force which pushes this. And then how about this? You talked about Einstein before, bro. So what about this? E equals MC. Nah, but seriously.
I was gonna say, you're trolling me too hard now.
Mass. Energy is mass, right? So what if you don't need a mass? It is just energy.
I think you're trying too hard to.
Psychological. Sorry, man.
Oh no, I think you're probably trying too hard to fit the stock market into yeah. So I don't know that there's an easy answer. I think if you want to research quantitative investing more, I think you probably can. Yeah, you can probably find more parallels and stuff like that. And it's not uncommon in science to find tons of parallels, right? Like we see this all the time in all kinds of fields. Algebra is all of a sudden really interesting to computer scientists and.
Oh yeah.
Stuff like that. So.
And you're right. If it's not exactly a 1-to-1 correlation, then at least it's inspiration for a different way of thinking. That's the way I see it, more or less. If it's not physics of market, and if there's no physics of the market, then at least it's just a different way of understanding maybe how price moves. So
well, I don't think you're way off though, because again, take a look at that book, Physics of Wall Street. I don't think you're way off. I think that.
Check it out. Thanks, man.
Yeah.